Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to it is December 17th, the week before Christmas of 2021, and I have Tammy and Lisa with me today for our panel discussion. So welcome. Tammy is joining us from Salt Lake City and Lisa from Boise, Idaho. So we are excited to be with you to talk a little bit about healthy strategies and framings for the holiday season to make it an authentic and meaningful time for you, regardless of where you may be, specifically in kind of faith transition land, if that's a space that kind of resonates for you. Let's hit our topic, because as I'm seeing online, there seems to be quite a bit of discussion on two different things that I think I'd like to talk about. One is, if you're going through a faith transition of some sort, there can be some grief in regards to losing some of your own traditional beliefs around Christmas, right? So Christmas, for a lot of Christians, Mormons, tends to be a religious holiday. So there can be a lot of, ideas and thoughts about what it used to mean versus what it now means. And of course, a lot of reminders through carols and music and visuals and, traditions, family traditions, and even church services that can bring up a lot of feelings and a lot of, just things that are difficult to kind of sort through. So that seems to be an area that a lot of people are talking about. The other area that seems to be difficult is managing extended family, because a lot of people are going to visit family, dealing with family during the holidays, wanting to be with family. But now you're in a different space than maybe you were before. And things that you used to talk about or used to enjoy or used to share with, certain traditions and things don't have the same feel or meaning. And that can bring about a lot of complex feelings. So why don't we start there? Maybe let's start with your own personal beliefs, and then we'll talk about family. So let's start with beliefs and any thoughts that either one of you have there.
Let's see, my beliefs about holidays. I think my approach has been to embrace the stories of Christmas, even though I probably wouldn't be considered like a literal or orthodox believer by most Mormons, and I haven't been for most of my children's lives, maybe all of their lives, because I, sort of went through faith transition, like for me in my late teens. I still, enjoyed reading the Christmas story out of the Bible with my children and talking about different elements and, viewing it more as sort of like cultural, spiritual education than as like telling my kids that they have to believe that this story literally happened this way, and like discussing the holidays, and kind of embracing a lot of the traditions, but just approaching it like from a slightly, like counterclockwise position, and I think that, my kids are all like kind of spiritual and they consider themselves Mormon, but like not in any kind of way that like would normally be, because they're all really gay. But we talk about the traditions of Mormonism and the traditions of Christianity, and we talk about like Jesus as a historical figure and as a mythical figure and as like all from all kinds of angles. And I really felt like the Christmas Story was a powerful one to talk about like teenage motherhood and the story, like there were lots of different ways. I actually had a friend who's an atheist who wrote a pageant, like a Christmas pageant for her Unitarian congregation. And, like we read it and would have the kids act it out and put on their bathrobes. And, so I did a pretty traditional Christmas, but just sort of counterclockwise.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that you still find a lot of meaning in non-literal ways of finding symbolism or value in the story of Christmas. And especially because we're surrounded by that in American culture. And so you still participate in a lot of that in your family traditions. Yeah. And that has been useful for you and your family.
Yeah. And I think it's been fun. And it's, like it kind of makes my kids feel connected to the wider culture. And it doesn't feel wounding or injuring to me in the way that I know it does to some people. Like I think if I'd been really wounded by the Christmas Story or really wounded by, like I might not want to include it, but I never did feel that personally, like there are definitely things about Mormonism I felt very wounded by that I wouldn't want to include in my family, but those weren't the things.
As we're talking, I'd really, invite people who may be watching to share some of their own thoughts about what's been helpful to them or what traditions they keep or don't keep for whatever reasons, or what parts do you feel particularly difficult that you haven't found solutions to. But Tammy, what are your thoughts?
Where I am in my belief system, it's strange because I just look at spirituality as, I think a little bit like Lisa, like very allegorical and symbolic of how it can show up in my life personally, in my human experience. The past, I love, for me, it's truly about connection. Relationships are important to me and connection is important to me. And how we do that, my approach is a lot more flexible. I come from a mixed faith family. I have, family that aren't members of a faith and some that are, and it means a lot to them. So I feel grateful that I'm in a place of detaching too much meaning to the thing and more looking at, in my perspective, is connecting in an experience. And so, like, for example, we go and have the traditional things with my parents and have it and go and enjoy that time with my family. And then also, I do a solstice night with, a sister, and I really enjoy the idea and the mindset of solstice and letting go of things that didn't serve me, in a year, and creating new intentions and purpose. And so giving myself permission to have flexibility of, I don't know. It's okay for me to not know exactly what's out there and what I believe and what I don't believe. And I get to change that as I gain new experience and new knowledge, and giving my kids permission to do that in the same way. I left a religion. I am no longer, my whole world is untraditional and not traditional. I'm not in religion. I am a single mother. So dealing with, my kids having their other families to negotiate and to work through. For me, I just want to, I'm a peacemaker. So I'm a fawner, but it's like, so for me, I'm cool with the flexibility of how do we want it to look and not holding to that so strongly. But I've also been able to have 6 years to negotiate that and to work through that, and to be able to let the emotion just kind of be desensitized a little bit. So, I think it's important also to give yourself permission to grieve what the images and what you've been given. This is how it's supposed to look like, and it may not be that way. And there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable emotions that come up from that, and giving yourself permission to grieve in all the joyfulness. right? To be really honest with, this can be really painful and hurtful, and give yourself permission to do that. And then also give yourself permission to say, hey, this is too much for me. I'm going to take a time out or do something different. Anyway, I can ramble on forever, but that's kind of my
I
approach
love
to
that.
it.
I love that. You brought up so many good points. I think I agree. I think that it's absolutely normal to grieve. And I'm glad you said, it's been 6 years. And I think, Lisa, you also talked about this being a long journey. You've been at this for a long time. I think it's different if this is your first Christmas where you're finding yourself in a very different place, belief-wise, versus, you're 6 years in. So if this is your first Christmas with very different beliefs from last Christmas, you may find this a very challenging year, with a lot of more triggers or tears or confusing feelings. And that's very normal. And you may hear some, like Lisa talk very eloquently about, oh, we do this and this. And you're like, oh my gosh, why can't I do that? And we'd be like, well, Lisa's been at it for a while.
Well, the beautiful thing is that you can, coming back into a space of getting to redefine what tradition looks like for you, or getting to redefine what works for you. But when you're in that space of unknowing, it's so uncomfortable, of what can I take, and what, giving yourself permission that you get to choose what works for you and what doesn't.
Well, and I think what you said, Tammy, is so important, because I feel like so many of my clients in the midst of this painful, disorganization of all my beliefs, feel like, well, I used to have this very defined, set, rigid belief system. And they sort of feel like I'll be okay when I have a new defined, rigid belief system.
Yeah.
And, and that's not actually I don't think that has to be the journey, right? That you just kind of move away from feeling like the only way to be safe and comfortable is having this rigid defined system, to being like, I get to choose what works for me. And if something that worked for me last year doesn't work for me this year, that's okay, right? It's flexible.
Yep. Well, and like you said, Tammy, too, I have clients who are like, you know what, this year and this is, of course, if you have the means to do this, but I've had clients that are like, we're all heading on to Florida for some totally different, we're not even doing a traditional Christmas at all, right? And we're going to take off and do something totally different because we don't even want to deal with Christmas. And so you do something very, very different before you re-engage in kind of creating new forms of traditions for yourself. And yet I do think that, over time, you can find new symbolism or new meaning, or find beauty in the abstract or the cultural aspects of things that you still may want to keep, in your suitcase. I always think it's an interesting analogy to think of like baggage. I always think about my purse, right? Like every 6 months I have to empty my purse. And I'm like, how in the heck did all this
get so heavy
get in here? But sure enough, I don't empty it all, right? I definitely put things back in my purse, but there's a bunch of crap that gets thrown away and that I don't need anymore. But there's definitely pieces that I keep in my purse that are still important to me, for sure. Okay, so what about family and boundaries and feelings and things in regards to dealing with people and traditions? What are some of the things that you see coming up for people that are difficult to navigate?
Well, this is going to shock everyone when I say this, but it turns out we come from a really codependent, enmeshed culture. Wow. And so, if you are in the midst of a faith transition and you're trying to learn to set boundaries, and you're trying to set boundaries at Christmas, turns out this can really upset people if you try to set boundaries at Christmas. Yeah, that has probably been a topic of conversation every day this week for me. People trying to set boundaries at Christmas time because things that have been expected of them in the past aren't going to work for them now, and how families just lose their minds because you're like, I don't know that I can stay in the big family house. Like, we're just going to come during the day and we're going to go sometimes and take naps. And families are like, whoa, can't handle it. You want free time and freedom. You don't love us.
Right. And believe it or not, this is not like just a Mormon issue, right? Like this happens in my non-Mormon Italian side of my family a lot too, right? So like grandmas get really sad and, different peoples get, because yeah, it's like, what do you mean? Does this mean you don't love us? So it is. Family relationships are hard, especially when loyalty and commitment means love and affection, and conformity means love versus boundaries. And that's, I think, something that we come from cultures a lot of times that conflate the two.
Yeah.
Well, and something that comes up for me a little bit, oftentimes we feel like that it's our job to emotionally regulate other people. And it's our responsibility to make sure they're not uncomfortable or they're not disappointed. But when we can come to the terms with the fact that, hey, you know what, we're not going to be able to please everybody all of the time. And disappointment is a real thing, but it's also a temporary emotion. And so you choosing your well-being over disappointing someone else is so important. And acknowledging it's okay. Like, yeah, it hurts. It feels really crappy inside our body when we cause disappointment to people that we love. But oftentimes we're creating a story in our head that's maybe not even the reality. That it's like they're saying, oh yeah, we're so sad that you're not with us, but they're so in their own world that they're going to kind of forget that they're not there. Right. So knowing that disappointment happens and that's okay, but where's that balance between your well-being? Sometimes it's a hard decision. They're hard decision either way, right? Having to deal with the uncomfortable emotions around things and learning that's just a part of it.
Right.
One of the things I will challenge my clients on is, like when they say, I feel guilty, I'm like, wait, what is this thing that you're labeling guilty, right? Like, do you really think you're doing something wrong? Because that's what guilty is, right? Or is it just, like you said, a discomfort because, people are disappointed? That's not really guilt, right? Like, or is it shame because, they're all going to be talking about you behind your back? That's still not guilt, right? Like, I feel like it can sometimes be useful to dig into those uncomfortable feelings. And instead of just like slapping a label, I feel guilty because I didn't, live up to everybody's expectations, like really dig into, well, is it guilt? Do you feel like you did something wrong? Or is it like, are there other uncomfortable feelings in there? Is there grief at the loss of like what you used to have? Is there, like there's so many things that can be. Usually I think slapping guilty on there just does us a disservice in like understanding the feeling.
Yeah. There are a lot of other feelings. I feel frustrated. I feel confused. Yeah. I feel disappointed myself. I feel judged. I feel uncomfortable that I'm letting my mom down. I feel sad, that this change has happened, things like that. I think too, a lot of Brene Brown stuff is very helpful, clear is kind. And I think finding common values and common language and the soft startups, that John Gottman talks about. So when you are talking about these things, I notice sometimes that when people are trying to place boundaries because we're so anxious, sometimes that anxiousness, we're actually harsher than we need to be, right? So it's like, I'm so anxious to set up this boundary that I'm just going to almost be mean about it because I have to like do it. And then we actually come across as even more difficult than we intend to be. So it's like, how do we say, hey, Mom, I know that you were expecting this from me and, you wanted, I always say that the opening prayer at Christmas dinner, for example, and, I'm so grateful that we're all going to have Christmas dinner today, this year. I just want you to know I'm not in a place to say prayer this time around. So, and I don't know if that's going to cause difficult feelings for you. I'm sad if it does. At the same time, please ask somebody else. Please know I love you. I can help in lots of other ways. These are other ways I'd love to help. are there any feelings that you have about that? I'd be happy to talk to you about that. How do we kind of soften, share love, share common values, say what I am able to do, say what I'm not able to do, keep our tone light, smile while we're saying things instead of like, and hopefully, welcome curiosity and questions where possible. To a point, or
Right.
if you're not able to welcome that, be able to say, I'm not in a place where I want to have a lot of discussion about this, but just know that my heart is in a good place. And I want us to have a comfortable time together as much as possible. And, our family has always been so important to us. And I want to focus on the real meaning of the time together, which is relational, like you said, Tammy, right? Like this, I think where we all have a common denominator here is our family relationships and love and connection. And that's where I want to really have us shine, so where do we find the common denominators?
Well, and I think that one of the frameworks that I find really useful is to like kind of think through the your family better than anyone. And so like really maybe digging into like emotional skills and emotional maturity, and like recognizing areas where your family might be deficient, and maybe you're deficient, and also maybe the people in your family, right? Like, and recognizing and kind of expecting that they will respond the way they always have, right? Like just go Google some like emotional maturity skills, emotional skills. Like, do your family dysregulate a lot? Do they, are they really rigid? Are they really inflexible? Are they really, what are the kind of like emotional deficits in your family? And then instead of trying to fix those, sometimes, I'm not against trying to like have those conversations if you feel like it could be productive, but sometimes, especially around the holidays, just like expecting your family to have the deficiencies and the lack of skills that they have, and just try and set your boundaries around those rather than like sort of just managing them, rather than trying to like process them or engage on them. Right.
Realistic expectations.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, are your expectations or what you're hoping for realistic in the situation that it's in? Questioning you and your feelings a little bit, having the courage and maturity enough to do that as well, instead of putting expectations on other people that may not know that you're possibly, setting up a test or a quiz that they might fail at because of their limitations or their beliefs. And so, loving people where they're at, and what does that mean?
Which is the hardest when it's your family, because they're the people who have installed most of your triggers. So
right. 100%. We didn't say it was easy. There's going to be a lot of discomfort, people. This isn't, I mean, it's not easy. It's not simple.
And I always like to remind people that some boundaries are internal, like some boundaries are not spoken because you don't necessarily have the confidence, like you said, Lisa, that they'll be, responded to well. So you just kind of place them for yourself. Like, okay, if this happens, I'm going to get up and go to the bathroom, right? Or if this happens, that's what I'm going to say. Okay, it was a good day, everybody. I'm going to take off now, right? Or at this particular time, that's when I'm going to leave, right? Or
I'm just going to change the subject. I'm just going to ignore what they just said, and I'm going to say, hey, how about the weather?
Or I'm not going to engage in this particular topic, right? Like, I'm not going to, accept invitations to talk about doctrine this Christmas, or.
And I feel like it can kind of go from two directions. Like if you're like, I'm a pretty like confrontational person. So, like sometimes I have to like psych myself up to like, okay, I'm not going to engage in that. But I feel like that there are people who come from the opposite way, where like they've always not engaged in that, and they have to psych themselves up to engage in it, right? To say, okay, I'm not going to run from the, so much of it depends on the individual circumstances of who you are and who your family is, and where you need to grow into,
Yeah.
And if you're willing to grow into it, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And as if this is the right time and the right people to grow into it with.
Right.
Because it's a difficult time to begin with, which gets me to our third point that we wanted to talk about. This, this is in general, although the holidays can be a wonderful time of year. It's the da, 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 whatever. It is also, as statistics show, a very challenging time of year for many people. It can be a time when mental health symptoms can rise, where suicidality can rise, where substance use can rise, where we are reminded of certain griefs, compounded griefs, like if you've, lost somebody in your family who's important to you. This, it can just be a time of triggers and difficulty. So I think it's just important from a mental health perspective to be thinking about self-care. I just would like to give us all a chance to talk a little bit about just overall well-being during a time of year that has a lot of potential for joy and also has a lot of potential for grief and difficulty. Yes?
Yeah, I'm I lost my father-in-law this time last year, and we're just really struggling in my house. And I lost my mom 2 years ago. So yeah, this time of year. So it's like a lot of grief shows up in my house right now. Like I'm thinking about a client of mine who recently divorced, and her husband got Christmas morning with her daughter this year. And she came in saying, I think I'm just going to be so depressed and sad on Christmas morning not to have my daughter with me. And we talked it through, and like she really came to a place where she's kind of excited to do Christmas by herself. She's like, I can just like sit in my pajamas in front of the fire and read a book. And, like she really just decided she's going to turn it into like a moment of self-care and like meditation and solitude. And she has a whole plan for making the day just lovely with herself. And and also just emphasizing that like the times when she will have with her daughter, and like like really making the most of those. And so like not to like discount or push away how painful those changes can be, but also trying to like lean into, well, what kinds of ways can I reinterpret this or reimagine what this change or this grief or this space can look like? Like, yeah, okay, maybe I lost my big grandma's house holiday, but like I got a trip to Florida. That, like, can we reimagine what this looks like and bring something good into it while also sitting with the sadness, like making space for that too?
I don't know if I can add anything to that. I love that, to be able to get into that mindset and that space of just being open to new things, to exploring new things, and at the same time giving yourself permission to grieve maybe dreams that you had about how something should look like, or grieve the process of losing specific family traditions, or whether that's in a loss of a divorce or a loss of religion or family or belief systems. There is a lot of beauty in giving yourself permission to grieve what could have been, or the template you were given that you just knew with no question, this is how it's going to look like. But again, giving yourself permission to go into that space of reimagining something and creating something. I think oftentimes we get stuck, especially if we come from a culture of being told how to do things and what to do. There's a lot of safety in that, and not realizing how much control and how much power, freedom that we have to do it on our terms. And I think sometimes we kind of get lost in that because we're so much focused on how it should be, that we're shitting on ourselves instead of how it can look, or all the different ways it could still bring joy, right? There's not only one way to have joy. There's lots of different ways. And how does that look and feel for you?
Yeah, I love everything you've both said. I think when I think about Mormonism, that most of us listening to this probably come from, there's a lot of growing up in a system about how life should look like, right? There's a prescribed idea, there's an ideal. And I think both when I work with believing clients and, active members of the church, and when I work with transitioning members and post-Mormons, both sets really struggle with having to come to terms with the reality that life doesn't really turn out with that ideal that we were kind of grown up with, that idea of if you follow the plan, life should kind of turn out this way. I also think that our American culture does that to us as well. Like if you study and are productive and you work hard, or you go to college, or you blah, whatever, A plus B plus C, you will just have the American dream, whatever that is, whatever, so again, we have these different types of cultural messages that sell you this this idea that life should look a certain way. And Christmas, having been kind of commercialized the way it is and hallmarked is the way it has been, and all the advertisings and it can be very difficult to sit in a space where you assume it looks a certain way for most people, when it really kind of doesn't look that way for a lot of people. So I think there is some reflecting that we can all do on recreating what it's going to look like to us, and to also step back from all those expectations. I also think there's just some basic self-care, just like avoiding some, like just things like overspending, time management. I mean, that's something that I struggle with, just getting enough sleep. I get so many ideas like, oh, if I bake cookies, or if I do this for the kids, or if I do that, and they're all really fun ideas, but then I overwork myself, and then I'm not in a good space. So I have to like step back, and it doesn't have to be all that to still be a good time. So having to just check my own perfectionistic, excited energy. And I think, connecting with others. So making sure we have some level of social connection with other people, as well as also having downtime, right? So kind of like you said, Lisa, some of us are social butterflies, and so we have no problems, but then maybe we're the ones that need some alone time. Like we need to lean into some alone time. And some of us are like really good at alone time, and maybe we need to lean into some social connection, right? And so where are we there? So I think just, eating well, remember to eating well, just basic self-care during this time. So that's, yeah. And then if you really, need to reach out for some more significant help, like a hotline, or checking yourself into an emergency room or a treatment center, or reaching out to a primary care provider, or going in for an assessment for medication, or reaching out to a therapist. Those are things that you can do, even through a holiday season. Some clinics, unfortunately, like ours, don't offer emergency care, but many, many clinics and emergency rooms and hotlines are open 24/7. So those resources are available. So we want to make sure you're aware of that, and that you can get help regardless of where you're at or what time it is. Even if it's 3:00 in the morning, you can reach out to somebody.
I think it can be especially hard to do that during the holidays, because you feel like, oh, I'm going to ruin it for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you're struggling, everybody else probably struggling too.
Yeah.
One, also reminding yourself that if someone reached out to you, would that be a burden for you? Right? We want people that we love and to care about and reach out when they're needing help and assistance. So then, giving yourself that love, that, okay, if I were to be in the opposite space, would I want someone that loved me to reach out and know that I could support them? It's not a burden. So we have to remind ourselves of that too.
Yeah. And then if you're not doing any of the things that I just mentioned, like if you're like, well, I already overspent or I'm not eating well, well, then just have grace for yourself. You'll figure it out. We can
Honestly, I think the most important self-care skill is self-compassion.
Yeah, self-compassion, right?
Right? Like it's the foundation of all the other self-care skills.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're doing any of the things on the self-care list and you're not doing them with self-compassion, they're not going to work well anyway.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Because self-care through shame is not self-care.
Self-care through judgment, not self-care.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place to end. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever else you'd say during this time to celebrate whatever beliefs or non-beliefs you have.
Happy solstice.
Happy solstice.
Yes. Happy all the things, whatever brings you joy.
That's right.
Happy all the things.
Happy all the things. And with that, we will sign off. So take care, everybody.
See you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous shoal. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst touch the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will.
Obey thy will.
When thou sayest to them,
Be still.
wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. 'Twixt twixt me and the peaceful rest. Then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,